Today on the Lazy RPG Talk Show, we're going to look at Black Flag's system reference document, Kobold Press's system reference document for Tales of the Valiant, released in Markdown. We're going to look at the Creating Monsters for Shadowdark Kickstarter. Mike Mearls was recently on Dungeoncraft talking to Professor Dungeon Master. We're going to dig into some of the things they talked about. I'm going to talk about my personal experiences having run a 2025 Monster Manual Adult Black Dragon versus my 9th level group. We're going to talk into Legendary Resistance alternatives today, alternatives for legendary resistance. We're going to talk about the End of One D&D. What is the End of One D&D? Have we reached the end of One D&D? I believe we have. We're going to dive into that. And we're going to cover more questions from the Patreon Q&A, all today on the Lazy RPG Talk Show. I'm Mike Shea, your pal from Sly Flourish, here to talk to you about all things in tabletop role-playing games. The Lazy RPG Talk Show is brought to you by the patrons of Sly Flourish. Patrons get access to all kinds of awesome tips, tricks, and tools like the 5e artisanal monster database, the random Sly Flourish random generator, the Dyson commercial map tool, virtual tabletop backgrounds for Dwarven Forge, and all kinds of other stuff that you get. You get a ton of stuff for becoming a patron of Sly Flourish, but most of all, what you get is to support me to help put on shows like this. To the patrons of Sly Flourish, thank you so much for your outstanding support. There has been a lot of drive and interest in getting more RPG products available in Markdown. A lot of times because people are starting to use Obsidian to do a lot of game planning and to organize their stuff. Obsidian loves Markdown. If you want to know more about Obsidian, check out obsidian.md, I think is the name of the site. It's a tool that you can have on your phone or your computer. Helps you keep track of notes, but it keeps it all in a very standard and easy to use format called Markdown. If you want to learn more about Markdown, you can Google Markdown and look into it. But Markdown is a very simple syntax for storing information. A lot of RPG products are now starting to do stuff in, I wouldn't say a lot. There are several RPG products that are starting to do stuff in Markdown, including a lot of the stuff coming from Raging Swan. This is the first publisher I have seen that was releasing stuff in Markdown. Got me excited about it, so I'm going to start releasing stuff in Markdown. Well, one of the new things we have is the Black Flag system reference document. The Black Flag system reference document is kind of the core engine behind Tales of the Valiant. And there is now available on GitHub a Black Flag SRD that includes all of the information, including like monsters and spells and spellcasting in Markdown formats, which makes it very easy to read and to drop into your notes, convert to other formats. You can turn it into an ebook. You can do all kinds of stuff with it. So it works really well for mobile devices. It makes the text available on lots of different platforms. So it's very cool to have this in Markdown. You can literally just download it and stick it into your Obsidian vault and view it in Obsidian. So you can keep all of your Markdown, all of your Black Flag SRD material, which includes like a lot of their monsters, a lot of their spells, a lot of other stuff, a lot of magic items available in a very easy to use Markdown format. So if you want to learn more about this, if you want to see the Black Flag SRD in Markdown, you can find a link down in the show notes. I thought that was really cool. The 5.1 SRD that Wizards of the Coast released under Creative Commons license is also available on Markdown. And I think over on my GitHub repo, we have the Level Up Advanced 5e system reference documents converted over to Markdown as well, which means you have a lot of 5e material available in Markdown that we can keep in our Obsidian notes. So you can copy and paste spells, copy and paste monsters. You can, sort and search easily. You can look things up on your phone really easily. Really nice to have stuff in Markdown. I think Markdown is a fantastic format, and I would love to see more RPG material made available in Markdown. One of the things I'm going to be doing over the next few weeks is getting City of Arches in Markdown. So the new book that I'm putting out is available in PDF, but we are going to be adding a Markdown and an EPUB version so that you can make a mobile-friendly version of City of Arches. I'm going to be working on that over the next couple of weeks, and then that will be released to everybody who had previously purchased City of Arches, everybody that backed City of Arches through the Kickstarter. Everybody will be getting access to the Markdown and EPUB versions of City of Arches. It's probably going to take me a couple weeks to get it done, though. It's going to be take some work. It's a 160-page book I got to convert, but I'm excited to do it. I'm happy to do it. So that is the Black Flag system reference document in Markdown. Over on Kickstarter, we have a new project this is done by Michael Putlak, who has been working on Shadowdark stuff. I believe is also a patron of Sly Flourish. Thank you for that. And has a new product coming out, which is creating and adapting monsters for use in Shadowdark. I have seen a preview of this book. It is excellent. It is a cool way to convert monsters from other systems and platforms, including 5e, into a more Shadowdark format. It is going to have the monster statistics by level table that is going to be available in here. And hey, look, you got a preview. Is it a one-click preview? Look at that, one-click preview. Somebody's paying attention. So it is a small zine that is going to have advice for how to convert monsters or build monsters for your Shadowdark game. When I saw it, I saw a preview of it, I heard about it, and I was like, ooh, this seems like Forge of Foes for Shadowdark. And he liked that quote, and I think that quote is available on his site. So it is a very, very cool product, very cool preview. I think it's going to be an extremely useful book for Shadowdark, really good tinkerer's guide for Shadowdark. And I'm very excited for it and happy to promote it here on the show. I did not receive, I think I got a free copy of the book, or like the current state of the book, but I didn't get a bunch of free stuff to preview it. I think it's really cool, and I think you should check it out. So that is the Creating Monsters for Shadowdark. If you are a Shadowdark GM, I think you're absolutely going to want this book. I think I'm definitely going to pick up, I don't think I've backed it yet, but I'm definitely going to back it at the physical one. I want to have a copy of the booklet, the zine physical. Oh, I did. See, I already did back it. Hey, look at that. I did back it. $12. $12 is a very reasonable price for a small booklet that will help you build your monsters for Shadowdark, which I think is a very useful thing to do. So that is Creating Monsters for Shadowdark, available on Kickstarter. You can find a link down in the show notes to back that fine Kickstarter. Mike Mearls was over on Dungeoncraft. Dungeoncraft by Professor Dungeon Master, big YouTube channel. I had a chance to have breakfast a couple times with Professor Dungeon Master while we talked about all kinds of things involved in the industry and stuff like that. And he had an interview that with Mike Mearls, the lead designer of the original 2014 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons, who also worked on 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons, now independent, working on his own RPG, and also works over at Chaosium, and talked to him about a bunch of things. And I thought it was an interesting interview. Some of the stuff he talked about was, I don't want to say like clickbaity, but like, I don't know why we still need to talk about it or not. And that was like, was 4th edition. So one question that Professor Dungeon Master asked him was 4th edition designed around World of Warcraft? Well, we've already seen other designers and lead designers, Rob Hainsou, talk about the connections between 4th edition and World of Warcraft and stuff like that. And all it does is cause arguments with people who love 4th edition and say, I don't want to, I don't think that's true. It's like, well, 2 lead designers and they'll tell you it's true. But it's also not like the design of 4th edition is exactly that of mirroring World of Warcraft. But there was a drive from the executives of Wizards of the Coast to say, we want you to bring World of Warcraft people over to Dungeons & Dragons. We are interested in capturing that market. We want to dive into digital, and we want a game that supports that. So, but who cares, right? The answer is 4th edition had happened. It is the way it is. It's out there. If you love it, you love it. No one can take away the fact that you love 4th edition if you love 4th edition, and nor is it up to you to try to convince everyone else that 4th edition is the best thing ever if they don't believe so. So it doesn't really matter, right? It's out. You can go get the PDFs. I have the PDFs of 4th edition. I have the physical versions of 4th. I have a whole shelf of 4th edition D&D stuff over there because 4th edition is really where I dove into becoming more than just a player of Dungeons & Dragons, but an actual person writing books and stuff like that. He also talked about bonus actions, which I thought was really interesting. Mike Mearls talked about bonus actions. And one of the things about bonus actions that is, I think, really kind of interesting to understand and think about how the approach towards bonus actions has changed in 5th edition D&D since it first came out until today, specifically when you look at D&D 2024. And what Mike described is that bonus actions were a limitation, not an expansion of actions in D&D. It was not intended that bonus actions become another action type that you kind of do on top of actions. Instead, bonus actions were a way to limit the number of extra things you could do on your turn as part of your action. So, and it's kind of a weird thing to think about, but think about it this way. You wouldn't want to play a game where the warlock could only do hex on their action, and they couldn't do anything else other than hex. Or Hunter's Mark, right? Like a ranger throwing Hunter's Mark on a creature should not be something that takes an entire action to do. They should just be able to do it. So but the problem is if you have somebody who's like a multi-class warlock ranger, that means theoretically they could do both of those things. If you tie it to an action, if you say like as part of your action, you can cast hex. Well, if you can also say as part of your action, you can cast Hunter's Mark, that means you could do both. And then if you like have a cleric in there, it's like as part of your attack action, you can cast Spirit Weapon. Well, now you're doing Hex and Spirit Weapon and Hunter's Mark all on your turn as long as you have access to all of those things. That's too much stuff. So instead, they created a resource called the bonus action. And the bonus action basically said, you can only ever do one of those things that we are designating as a bonus action once per action. And that way you can only do a Hunter's Mark or a Hex or Spirit Weapon, but you can't do all three. It was, but the concept behind it is that you never had a bonus action unless you had something that you could use in a bonus action. It was not intended to be another action type. But it never worked out that way. And instead what happens, and everybody, this is why it's weird. Everybody ever, now most people, most of the time, players, if you're a GM, this is not going to be uncommon to you, where a player will say, okay, I attack, I do this other thing, I'm going to move over. Wait, let me see if I have a bonus action. No, I'm good. I don't have anything right now. They would stop and pause the game to look for whether or not they had something they could use as a bonus action, because it's optimal to be able to use it. If this is a resource that your character has available to you, you want to be able to use it. Then as the game expanded, as you saw Xanathar's Guide and Tasha's come out, that they started to put more bonus action stuff in there. More characters had it. You also had, every character had access to some bonus actions, like attacking with an offhand weapon was something every character could do. So technically everyone had a bonus action. But then I played, for example, in a game with my friend Chris ran, and I played a Rune Knight. And I'll tell you, I had more bonus actions than actions. I had more things I could do in my bonus action than things I could do in my action. And that was the first time I looked at it and looked at bonus actions and realized bonus actions are just actions. They're as big as actions. They can do things as big as actions. They're just not actions. You basically have two actions that you can do on each turn, with a set of things that count for one type of action and a set of things that count for another. But it's not any smaller. It's no longer like an optional sort of add-on thing. They are big chunks of characters. And then we come to D&D 2024. And in D&D 2024, not only do we have actions and bonus actions and lots of stuff you do in your bonus actions, now we have a bunch of things that are more similar to the original idea of things that stack onto your action that don't take anything to use. The example is the Paladin that I played. I played a 7th level Paladin. I was an Oath of Glory Paladin, and I would have an attack, and then I could, as a bonus action on a hit, which is more like a reaction, but whatever, I could then smite, right? Which makes sense, so that now they're limiting smite as a bonus action, again, using that resource up by saying, oh, you can't smite on your second attack because you already used your bonus action. So I would smite, but then the smite could also trigger another ability that let me use my Channel Divinity for free, that then cast, what is it called? Inspiring Smite. And Inspiring Smite let me then pool up a bunch of temporary hit points and then divvy it out to all the people around me. That was all part of my attack. Now, granted, the bonus action was the Smite part of it. So technically the Smite, the Channel Divinity, and the Inspiring Smite was all my bonus action, kinda. And then I get to sap on top of that, because that's my weapon mastery, and the weapon mastery does not take any kind of action to do. So I had like 5 things that I was doing on a single attack, because they wanted players and characters to be able to do all of those things without necessarily having to only pick one of them. It's a lot of stuff. So anyway, when you think about what the original design was for bonus actions and how that has evolved now over time, it's kind of an interesting look at one specific mechanic of 5e to see how that played out. It's really kind of interesting. So there was some talk about it. I think I just spent more time talking about it than they did on the show, but it's really interesting. One thing that Mike brought up in this interview was that designers and Professor Dungeon Master brought up as well, the idea that the designers of the game have their own house rules that they run that are different from the game that they're playing. And anytime you watch like Chris Perkins running a live play game, you will see him throw a bunch of different kind of house rules at it. And I've had other friends of mine who have watched designers play the game who say like, it's like they don't even know the game they've made, right? That they're picking a lot of stuff that they're doing and changing all the time. But you can definitely see it in live play games, and you can kind of hear it. And if you ever have an opportunity to watch them run games at conventions and stuff like that, you'll see like they've got a bunch of things they do that are kind of different. I've seen it myself. I've seen it where they're like, oh, we're just not going to use that rule that you have there. And so there's this interesting idea that the designers themselves have hacked their own system. And what that means is you should absolutely feel free to hack the system yourself. You probably already feel this, but you should really feel it because they're hacking their own system all the time. And this is a long-standing tradition that goes all the way back to Gary Gygax and the original versions of D&D, were basically house rules that they ran. And sometimes they'd publish them and sometimes they wouldn't. And sometimes they would run it differently at their own table. Again, the game is ours. We get to do what we want with it. But don't hang on to the idea of the stuff in the book is canon and solid and you can't ever change it because the people who wrote it change it all the time. Now, here is the most interesting thing that I thought came out of this. And I've heard Mike Mearls talk about this on a couple of different interviews that he's been on. And it really resonates with me. It's an interesting way to think about the products that are coming out for role-playing games. And his point, I'm paraphrasing from another podcast that he was on, but essentially like the argument that everybody should be paying for an RPG, not just the GM, is kind of flawed because nobody says that with Settlers of Catan. Nobody says like, oh, every player should bring their own little miniature box of Settlers of Catan with them to the table. No, it's expected you can have one for your entire table. RPGs should really be like that too. Like it should be expected that the true consumer of an RPG are the game masters, the GMs, us. We're the ones that are really buying the products. We buy a lot of products. I realize that I have spent, even though I've got a bunch of different preview copies of the D&D 2024 books, I got a full set of the physical books, and I got a preview copy for Roll20, and I have a preview copy for, or not a preview copy, but like a collaborator copy for D&D Beyond. So there's 3 versions of it that I have. I have spent $300 on other versions of it. Because I wanted to have my own set of core books that weren't given to me as a preview copy. I bought the entire set for Foundry, and I think I've got some other one where I bought it. But I've spent a lot of money on it too. I spent a ton of money on RPG products. And I think that GMs are really the true customer of RPG products. But a lot of times, the products that are being developed are not really being focused on us as GMs. And a lot of time they try to make products, and you'll see everybody does this. A lot of people make products that also has like character options in the hope that players will buy it too, so that you could sell more copies. But I don't think they really do. And I think that it's easier, instead of having a bunch of new character options, why not just write more material that really helps GMs run games? That's something I put as a core tenet when I was making City of Arches. It's something that Scott and Teos and I talked about when making Forge of Foes. Who exactly were we writing this for? And we were writing it for GMs to be able to modify their games and run things and build monsters and give them settings that make it easy for GMs to run games. Not, hey, here's a whole bunch of new character options. So one of the things that I think came out of this is this idea that if the metaphor of, that all the players should be buying stuff from an RPG company is sort of flawed, then another approach, another way of looking at it is this idea that producers of RPG products are making expert software for expert users. That we GMs are not run-of-the-mill RPG players. We're not just ones picking up for their first time. Some are, but not all of us. But once we've got playing for a little while, now we need other tools to help us run our game more easily, help us get groups together, help us run fun sessions, help us build worlds, save us time, give us things we can't make ourselves. We are like users of Photoshop and users of Final Cut more than we are like users of AOL, right? Or other sort of general purpose users. We are expert users who need expert software to run it. And I think it's interesting when you look at Game Master guides as an example. If we look at the Tales of the Valiant Game Master's Guide, the Level Up Advanced 5e Trials and Treasure, and the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide, we can kind of see a difference in design philosophy that I think if you look at the Tales of the Valiant Game Master's Guide, and keep in mind, I wrote part of it. I was commissioned to write for the Game Master's Guide, so I'm definitely biased in my understanding of the Tales of the Valiant Game Master's Guide. But I think that book, more than the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide, is a book written for experienced game masters to help give them tools to change their game, modify their game, and build their game in lots of different directions. And if we look at the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide, they stepped away from a lot of that stuff. For example, a big one is there is no monster statistics by challenge rating list. There's no real way to build a monster from scratch using the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide. They have some guidance about reskinning them, but we have nothing about what the difference is between a legendary monster and a normal monster. We can look at the books and reverse engineer the fact that legendary monsters seem to be doing more damage than normal monsters at the same challenge rating. I think that's really good, but I'd sure like to know what went behind it. And it would be interesting to see some actual tables that they use in order to benchmark their own stuff. There's very few house rules in the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide. There were a bunch more house rules that existed in the 2014 guide. One argument could be lots of people didn't use them, so why publish them? That's certainly an option. But another one is sometimes reading those rules gives you ideas about other house rules you could put in play, and it gives you really good thoughts and advice for why you might want to have house rules. So I look at it and say the Tales of the Valiant Game Master's Guide is really more of that line of expert software written by expert users than the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide is. The 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide is still a really, really good book. It's fantastic for new game masters. I think it does a really good job of explaining how the game works. It gives a lot of stuff in there. But there's a lot of sections that are in the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide that I think could have been replaced with more usable tools to help us run our game. I expect, and I was doing it just an hour ago, I'm going to be able to use the Tales of the Valiant Game Master's Guide pretty much any session that I'm running where I have that book in front of me, because there's so much material in there I can dive into and look from random encounter tables, monster building guidelines, encounter building design stuff, optional rules, doom points. There's all kinds of stuff that are in there that I can sort of reference and go back to regularly. I have a feeling other than magic items, I don't know how often I'm going to need to go back to the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide. They don't have tables for building dungeons out. They don't have ideas like what kind of chambers might exist in an old shrine. There's nothing like that, but the Game Master's Guide has that. So that's where I think that idea, and this I think about more as a publisher than necessarily as a game master. From a game master, it's the standpoint of, are the producers of material giving me expert software to help me run my games? Or are they just kind of filling out a book with a bunch of stuff that I'm probably not going to use? And from a publisher standpoint, it's how do I write better products to help good, experienced game masters run their games more easily or add more fun to their games and things like that. So it's something that I'm definitely thinking about. But that whole topic kind of shifted my mind and I think kind of pushed me in a new direction. So really interesting interview, thought-provoking for me, and something that I'm going to think about in the future. Speaking of D&D 2024, this past week in my Wednesday game, I said, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to flop out. This is one of the great things about 5e, is I can flop out the Monstrous Menagerie, which I had been using for my monster book for my Wednesday game, and flop in the 2025 Monster Manual. Again, I did get a preview copy of the 2025 Monster Manual. I also bought my own copy, and I bought my own copy on Foundry. So my money's where my mouth is as well. But I thought, let me just try some of these 2025 monsters. Let me actually see what they're like. And the monster that I was going to run, my group is 9th level. We have half of the group are running 2024 D&D characters. The other half of the group are running level up advanced 5e characters in the same game. I've talked about that before. Turns out it works just fine. But it gives me the opportunity to run 2025 Monster Manual monsters. And this past week, I had the opportunity to really run two kinds of monsters. Yeah, three monsters. I ran the Treant stat block, I ran the Stone Giant stat block, and I ran the Adult Black Dragon, all from the 2024 Monster Manual. And they worked great. I was very happy with them. They ran fine. They hit hard. They were interesting. They did things that we didn't expect, that the players didn't expect. Overall, big thumbs up. They hit hard. They challenged the group. Everything worked out. The Treant was interesting. It is CR 9 with only 138 hit points. Again, if I'm looking at it, usually about 20 hit points per challenge rating. So I would expect about 180. In fact, I did up the hit points on the Treant a little bit to give it like an extra round. What's really interesting about the Treant is that all of its challenge rating is really bundled into the Animate Trees option. One time per day, it can summon 2 other trees that use its own stat block to attack, and it attacks right after it does, which means you definitely want to have round 1, any Treant that you have should immediately summon other Treants. And then those Treants get to attack, making 2 slam attacks for 16 damage each. So that actually worked well. It meant that suddenly they went from 2 Treants to 6 Treants, and the 6 Treants are hitting with 2 attacks each, 12 attacks times 16 damage per attack. A lot of attacks. But those first 2 don't get to attack on the first round. They have resistance to bludgeoning and piercing, which makes them harder to hit, but they have vulnerability to fire. At 138 hit points, when they get hit with fire, they are going to drop really fast. So those hit points are pretty low. I would definitely consider giving them like 50 more hit points. If you have got people that are throwing fire on them, if you want these things to last, you're going to want to throw more hit points on them. Because the big one is when that first Treant dies, it's any summoned Treants go with it, which means it's got a really good, fast way for the battle to end, which I like. But if you don't put enough hit points on the initial Treants, they're going to die right away. Like 138 hit points, assuming people are hitting them with fire, is whatever, about 70 damage. And that's like 2 or 3 fireballs, and you can take care of both of them. So they worked really well. I think I was running 6 9th level characters against 2 Treants, and it worked out just fine. But one thing I did do was I bumped up their hit points a little bit to withstand the extra fire. I think vulnerability to fire is so powerful that if they don't have extra hit points to account for that vulnerability, they're going to drop, even if they have resistance to bludgeoning and piercing. So Your mileage may vary, but I would keep your hand on the dial. But that worked really well. Then I ran a big battle where they fought 2 stone giants and 1 adult black dragon. But we'll start with the stone giants. So the stone giants are CR7s, 126 hit points, a little bit below the 140. AC 17, so pretty hard to hit. 2 attacks, +9 to hit, 22 bludgeoning damage. That's a good pile of damage. They could throw boulders for 15 damage each, so not quite as much damage, but now there's a reason why you would want to stay away from them rather than get on top of them. And then they had the deflect missiles trait, which did come up in play. They were happy, and the players were interested to see how that played out. One thing I did with the stone giants, and I'll get into this for the encounter overall, is I threw in another idea from Tales of the Valiant called Doom Points. In my game, I call them dreadful incursions. No, dreadful blessings. So dreadful blessings are essentially replace legendary resistance and let me do other things other than just automatically saving on a saving throw. And in this case, I use dreadful blessings in order to drain the life from the stone giants and give it to the adult black dragon, which you'll see. So I wouldn't say that it was a pure vanilla, perfect scientific experiment running these monsters, but I did get to see the stat blocks run, and I thought the stone giant worked really well. The adult black dragon also works really. CR 14, good pile of damage, right? Acid breath for 54 points of damage. I really like the rend attacks, which do 17 damage on a hit, 13 plus 4 acid damage. They do 3 rend attacks and then can do 3 additional rend attacks as legendary actions if they want to. I loved the Cloud of Insects was really cool. Like Cloud of Insects uses 1 legendary action, DC 17, 22 poison damage and disadvantage on saving throws to maintain concentration. Fun way to break concentration. So then I got to the things I didn't like. And it turns out I was right, at least for me. Right? I really hate it when you bury your effects under a spell. And in this case, Frightful Presence. The dragon uses spellcasting to cast Fear. And I was like, Fear, that's probably like 1 target. I'll just do the thing. Oh, it turns out, no, Fear is a cone. I had to go look it up in the player's handbook in order to figure out what Fear did. That kind of sucked. I wish you just tell me what to do in here. Don't make me go look it up. Too late. We already have the book. It already was the way it is. So this worked very well, but 195 hit points is actually not nearly enough hit points against 6 9th level characters. So what I did is because I was using these dreadful blessings where I had 4 of them. So I replaced legendary resistance and he was in his lair. So he had 4 of these things. And dreadful blessings let me do other things like automatically recharge and use the acid breath, get an extra action on a turn, get advantage on all attacks till the end of the next turn, pierce through resistances. It lets me do lots of things. But I think I used it exclusively for legendary resistances, like getting rid of, making a save when it would normally fail. But then I also had it use them automatically to drain the life from existing stone giants and turn that into temporary hit points. So he could boost his hit points up. When he was getting picked on, he could use the stone giants as batteries for hit points to get hit points back. That worked really well. I talked to my players about it afterwards, and even though like one of the players hit him with like a 50-point critical hit, and as soon as he got hit, he drained one of the stone giants, killed the giant, and got temporary hit points back. And I was kind of looking at the player like, is he going to be mad about that? And he's like, no, I thought that was great. Like it got rid of one of the stone giants. It still boosted him up. He thought it was fine. So he didn't feel robbed from his attack. And that's really a trick with Dreadful Blessings, is figuring out like, are you robbing him with an attack or not? But overall, I thought the Adult Black Dragon ran great. The idea of switching out Claws and Bite with Rend is fine. I mean, it makes his stat block a little slimmer, which is certainly fine. I thought it hit really hard, like good roll of attack. I just wish that the Melf's Acid Arrow, which is described in its multi-attack, and the Frightful Presence instead described what they do. One little trick that I would do, if you want, is if you want to replace the Melf's Acid Arrow, and you probably do this with all the spellcasting ones, just take one of its other attacks and attacks and damage, and just make that like a ranged attack and reflavor it into whatever you think the other one was. So I could take a Rend attack and say he does a +11 attack as a ranged attack, doing 17 acid damage. And it would feel exactly like Melf's Acid Arrow, kind of, other than it doesn't do the extra damage on a turn. But it still would work just fine. And same with like the Fear, I could just say he picks a target, he does a DC 17 check, or DC 18, whatever, and then that creature is afraid of him, right? And you could just do something like that. So you can improvise those rather than looking them up, but I still feel like looking them up is not a thing. Now, in the video where I talked about this extensively last week, a bunch of people are like, yeah, well, that's why you use D&D Beyond. You just highlight it. I use the physical books. I bought the physical books. I want to use the physical books on my table. So the fact that it works well in online tools does not help me. and I want to see it in, I wish it was in the book. So what it proved to me is that, to me, I said it was my biggest problem with the monster manual. It is still my biggest problem with the monster manual, and it was one that immediately was a problem for me on the first night where I used it at my table. Still, otherwise, the monsters ran really great. Boss monsters need help. In Forge of Foes, myself and Scott Gray and Teos Abadia describe boss monsters. And one of the things that I wanted to hammer a stake into the ground on is that boss monsters need help simply because they're bosses. That the minute you put a boss monster out there, characters and players love to zero in on that boss and beat the hell out of that thing. They use every spell at their disposal, every way to stop that boss from doing anything that they can do, hitting them as hard as they can. There isn't this, very rarely do characters go and separate out and go fight all the minions. Instead, they almost always zero in on the boss, which means the boss needs ways to be able to handle that focus. In D&D 2024 and in the D&D 2025 Monster Manual, it looks like legendary monsters have gotten a pretty significant boost to damage output to account for the fact that they are legendary. Beyond, even if you compare them to a monster of equal challenge rating, there have been some studies that have shown, there have been some web pages where they've talked about how legendary monsters do more damage than non-legendary at the same challenge rating. That's a good impression. However, usually what they need is defense, not offense. Usually high challenge rating monsters, if you're in the assumption you're running more modern ones, they do a lot of damage already, but they need more protection. The most common way to protect a boss monster from getting completely pinned down and destroyed is through a thing called legendary resistance. If you're familiar with 5th edition D&D, you've seen legendary resistance applied to legendary monsters since the 2014 Monster Manual came out. And basically the way they work is that a monster has so many legendary resistances, and if they fail a saving throw, they can turn one of those in to succeed on the saving throw instead. Some people really don't like it. Matt Colville, for example, has said that he really hates legendary resistance. Lots of players don't like it too because it feels arbitrary. There's no real reason for why this monster has this thing, and all it does is shut down our cool abilities. The thing is, if you didn't have it, those bosses would just get pinned down and destroyed. The bosses would be really anticlimactic if they didn't have some way to deal with save or suck effects. Oh, we banished it, or we dominated it, or we polymorphed it. There's all of these spells that can take out a boss in a single hit, on the assumption it makes its saving throw, which, probably about half the time. So it needs something like legendary resistance to be able to deal with it. But a lot of people don't like legendary resistance because it does feel like this arbitrary nope button that says, no, you're not going to get it to work. So today we're going to talk about a few different ways to deal with legendary resistance, alternatives to legendary resistance that are out there, and ways to make legendary resistance a little bit more interesting for you and for your players. So one of the big ones is showing your players that the monster has legendary resistance and how many of them they have. One way to do this is have little tokens on your table or some kind of visual display, whether it's a index card that everyone can see that has check boxes on it, little boxes for every one of the legendary resistances, and every time you burn one off, you check it off. That way they can see the progress they're making by burning through legendary resistances and match that against how the battle is going and decide, do they want to keep burning down legendary resistances with save or suck spells, or do they want to just keep hitting it with damage? One thing I've noticed is that almost all the time, my legendary monsters die before they use up all their legendary resistances, which means that players are wise to the fact that they have legendary resistance and don't want to waste a spell when they're like, I guess I'll hit it with damage instead, because I know that my dominate monster isn't going to work. I think that's a fine strategy. But some groups do like to burn through legendary resistance, or even still see how they're burning through legendary resistance, and having some kind of physical way of showing the legendary resistances that a monster has works. One other real important tip is tell your players when they're fighting a legendary monster. You don't have to hold it back. Let them know. Tell them this is a legendary monster. It's going to have legendary resistances. Let them know. You don't have to hide that, and it's a lot less fun for them when they blow a big spell and go, oh crap, I didn't know it was legendary, right? Like, that's lame. Instead, tell them it's a legendary monster. If they cast a spell, remind them, well, he's got legendary resistance. Are you sure? This is that whole idea that sometimes players are only getting about half of what you're telling them. They're not idiots. They really wish they hadn't, they're going to wish they hadn't done it unless they know. But if you tell them that they have legendary resistance and you show them how many they have, then the players are making informed choices about what they're going to do when they're casting their big effects. Now, another way is to show the legendary resistances in game. Level Up Advanced 5e does this, and the Flea Mortals also does this, which is a way to show in the world what a legendary resistance is. An easy way is like you face the Auravax, the adult black dragon, and over his head you see 3 spinning glyphs. And then you tell him those glyphs are his legendary resistances. And every time you hit him, one of those glyphs disappears. So now you have kind of an interesting way to show what the legendary resistance is. Maybe they are a necklace with 3 glyph stones. Maybe they're 3 ion stones that are spinning around their head. Maybe they've got carved scales. Maybe they've got shields of protection that shatter every time one of them is destroyed. Try to imagine what a legendary resistance looks like in the world. And that way your players can see what they're doing in the world itself. That's kind of a fun way to do it. The original lead designer of the 2014 version of D&D, Mike Mearls, had an interesting one that he brought up, which was the idea of, instead of legendary resistance, what if a legendary monster auto-saves on all saving throws until they're bloodied? I.e., for the first half of the battle, you have to inflict damage to them. They're going to automatically save on all other effects. But then as soon as you get them down to bloodied, now they're making saving throws like normal. It was interesting. I talked about this in the Sly Flourish Discord server and got pushback on that idea, saying it was too arbitrary. I don't know that it's any less arbitrary than normal legendary resistances are. I don't think it's actually any harder for the players either, because, again, my players often destroy a monster before it even uses all its legendary resistances. So if it's going to have all of these legendary resistances to save anyway, why not just have it automatically save every time until it's bloodied? And now the strategy for fighting monsters is different. I brought it up with my group and they were kind of like, yeah, that's kind of interesting. We'll try that. So I might throw that on some boss monster one time, that instead of having legendary resistances, they have this auto save, automatically succeed on saving throws until they're halfway down. Again, I would tell my players that this is going to happen. I would not surprise them by this. I would explain that that's how it's going to work so that they can tell that that's going to work. Don't try to hide the strategy. So anyway, I thought that was an interesting way. Now, another one, which I talked about when I was talking about running my Ancient Black Dragon, is Doom Points. So Doom Points is a feature of Tales of the Valiant. Tales of the Valiant has many really cool ideas that you can bring into any of your 5e games. The luck system replacing inspiration is one of them. The other one is Doom Points. I have referred to these when I was testing them myself as Dreadful Blessings, but you can call them whatever you want. Doom Points is fine. Dreadful Blessings is also fine. The concept here is that in different encounters, you have these Doom Points. You have a number of Doom Points that are based on like the CR of the encounter. But another way to handle it is to basically replace legendary resistances with Doom Points. So Doom Points can do what legendary resistances do. You can turn in a Doom Point in order to automatically save on a saving throw you might fail. But you can also use them for other things, and you get to decide what those other things are. Some examples, which you can find in the Monster Vault and in the Tales of the Valiant Game Master's Guide, include things like getting advantage on attacks, or forcing someone's disadvantage on a saving throw, piercing through elemental resistance. There's lots of different things you can do with it. But really, there's sort of like a GM intrusion point from like the Cypher system for 5e, where we can look at it and say, these points let the monster break the rules. So an extreme example would be a Death Knight with a Doom Point can rip through a Force Cage, right? Or a ancient green dragon can use a Doom Point to have its poison breath pierce through elemental resistances and turn elemental immunity, poison immunity, into poison resistance instead. It kind of barrels through the immunity because of it. You could use them to have a monster recharge and automatically use a breath weapon. You could have a monster that gets an extra action because they use this thing. So you can use them for lots of different things. I have kind of two hard rules that I keep in mind when I'm talking about using Doom Points or Dreadful Blessings. One is I describe how they work to the players before we ever use them, so they understand what they are and how they work. And two, I make sure it's clear to the players how many of those Doom Points there are in a battle by, again, check marks on an index card or little tokens that are in front of me, so they know that they're in place and they know when I've used them and they know they're gone and I can't use them again. So that is the limitation on it. The other limitation is you are only using these to make the game more interesting. You're not punishing your players. You're not trying to get them. It's not a competition. You only use them in a way that you think makes the game overall more interesting. If you think the boss is just going down too quickly, maybe he uses them to drain all of the hit points from nearby enemies in order to get extra temporary hit points himself. Or again, if you feel like the monster is just not providing the kind of challenge that it should, given its position in the fiction of the game, you can use doom points to increase that challenge. So I think it's a really powerful tool. I think it's really cool. And it's a fun, I've been using it in my Wednesday game, and I've had good success, and I've gotten good feedback from my players that they don't feel like they're this complete arbitrary cheat card, and instead are interesting ways for the characters to face these big monsters that they're facing. And then finally, you can just stick to good old legendary resistance. The 2025 Monster Manual didn't do anything, didn't really change legendary resistance at all. And if they're working fine for you, they're working. You don't necessarily have to try any of this other stuff. If you don't like any of these ideas, of course you don't have to do any of these ideas. But it's kind of nice to have a toolbox of different potential things we could do for monsters in order to make sure that boss monsters provide an interesting, challenging threat to the characters without stealing agency away from the characters, and making it clear to players what the system is that they're playing in order to defeat these things, but also ensuring that they're not just completely dominating boss monsters. So those are just a handful of potential alternatives to legendary resistance. Hope you found that useful. Back in August 2022, we saw our first video from Wizards of the Coast describing 1D&D. And 1D&D, if you go watch, I went and watched the video again because I was like, it's kind of interesting to go look at how this whole thing kind of started. How the whole thing with the new revision of D&D kind of started. And it started with this big idea of like, hey, we've got a bunch of different things that are going on. Everything from a new set of revised core books to a 3D virtual tabletop and a lot of other stuff to be combined, which was all piled around a concept called 1D&D. And for a long time, 1D&D was used as by the RPG community, by followers of D&D, as the revised core books. A little while ago, they kind of stopped talking about 1D&D and started stuck to it. If anybody that has worked in corporate life recognizes all the times when big executive corporate folks like to refer to 1X, oh, we're all going to be one group now. I don't want to have separate fiefdoms. We're all under one envelope. So you can kind of tell that was sort of an internal corporate-y marketing name for 1D&D. But it was called that. So the interesting thing is, when we talk about the end of 1D&D, the end of 1D&D for me happened at one specific moment. And that moment was this past Tuesday. And that past Tuesday was the day that the 2025 Monster Manual was available to everybody. You could buy it everywhere. And at that point, all three, pardon me while I knock over a bookshelf, all three of the D&D 2024 core books are now out and available. You can buy them online. You can buy them at a local game shop. You should go buy it at your local game shop if you can. And that's the whole system. And what's interesting to me about it is that we spent so much time. I spent so much time thinking about it, diving into it, watching their videos, the play tests, looking at the play tests that were going on, play testing some of the stuff. I play tested some of the early stuff with my groups. And all the discussions. Then at the summit that occurred in early 2023, that was when we first found out about weapon mastery, and people started talking about that. And there was so much time and attention and thought, and what are monsters going to be like, and what's the DMG going to be like, and so much things happened. And for like 2 years, we saw, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of YouTube videos talking about it, thousands of posts on various forums, social media, hundreds of thousands of social media posts that dove into like what the future of D&D is going to be. What is 1D&D? What's going to happen? All kinds of like big thoughts. And in the end, this is it, right? We've got the whole thing right here. And now it's done. It's out. These aren't going to change, right? Like these physical books are not going to change. They're going to sit on my shelf. I'm going to sit over here on this. Oh, they're so big, I can't get them back on the bookshelf. They're really heavy. It's done now. And it's kind of interesting to be done with it. We don't have to speculate anymore about any part of it. We know everything that's going to be in it. We know everything that isn't in it. We know the good. We know the bad. We don't necessarily know exactly what the game is going to be like after having played it for a while. That can take like a year or two before we really know. But a lot of times with previous versions of D&D, we had a good idea of like the kind of stuff that worked and the kind of stuff that didn't work right pretty early on. Some of the problems with 4th edition, the lead designer of the Essentials version, one of the designers of 4th edition said that he noticed problems with combat length before the game had even come out. Right, which is the most, in my opinion, the biggest problem with 4th edition D&D was the length of combat. You don't have to tell me about how you managed to deal with combat length. I think it's pretty safe to say it was a very common complaint that 4th edition combat length took too long. The point is, we kind of knew that early on, and looking at this, we can speculate about areas that might be problematic, like so many different options and so many different actions and so many different weapon maneuvers that everything slows down. But I think by now we'd really see how much of a problem that was. And I think the answer is it's probably not that much of a problem. I think that this version of the game, this would be a fun one to come back to in 2 years and say, hey, Mike, you were right about that. Or, wow, Mike, you were so wrong. It turned out to be a complete disaster. Or it turned out it was so much better than you said it was going to be. Well, it could be one of those two things. I think it's pretty solid. And I don't think it has major problems that are going to hinder people from being able to play the game if they want to play the game. That's the main thing. But what's really interesting to me is like it's over now. Now, we still don't have Project Sigil, the 3D VTT. I am of the belief that the 3D VTT is not going to have that big an impact on the game one way or the other. The big reason why I think that is that everybody has to download a client to a big beefy laptop or workstation in order to be able to play with a 3D VTT. And I just don't think that many people really care. It's not near the impact that D&D Beyond is going to have, because D&D Beyond is kind of the centralized place to find all D&D 2024 rules on the web. I don't think it's going to have that big an impact. So one could argue that part of 1D&D is still kind of going on and we're still going to see it play out. But we're already seeing them describing it in different ways. There were reports in magazines that said that they were now describing it as more of a DM preparation tool than as a virtual tabletop. I wouldn't put a lot of money on how good Project Sigil is going to be. I don't think it matters that much. There's maybe two other. I will bring up two other things that are still kind of outstanding that I would say kind of will truly be the bookend of this 1D&D time. This almost like 2.5 to 3 year, probably a 3 year period where we looked at the revision of the game. One is when Wizards of the Coast releases the 5.2 system reference document under the Creative Commons. They said they were going to do this. They said it multiple times. They've even said recently that they want to do this. And I think it's actually not only in the interest of the whole TTRPG community for them to put it out there. I think it's in their interest too, because they definitely want people writing products around D&D 2024 that they can then find the successful ones and then bring them onto D&D Beyond. So it benefits them directly. In fact, I probably one day will have a new clickbait thing, a clickbait headline sort of idea, which is that Wizards of the Coast won the OGL war. And my short hypothesis about why they won the OGL war is that they are basically getting the thing that they wanted to get with the OGL 1.1, which is publishers to publish material on their own that they could then take a cut of. The only difference is the way they get that cut is by bringing them onto D&D Beyond and then taking their cut from the sales of the D&D Beyond sales. So they're basically getting the same thing they wanted, a little bit more limited and certainly with a much more freedom to the publisher. But it's still kind of the same thing, only they wouldn't have had to cause a big catastrophe to do it. So when that 5.2 SRD comes out, that will be a big benchmark. And another big benchmark will be a new starter set, which is coming out later this year. So once that's happened, it'll be about 3 years since the initial part of D&D, of 1D&D, and we will actually have everything at that point. But we already know what the rule set is. The main thing that we were waiting for with 1D&D is what is the rule set going to be like? And now we don't have to speculate about that anymore. And here's where I think it's a really valuable thing I think is important to understand. Now it's our turn. Now we have the books. We no longer need to look to them or try to get them to do anything one way or the other. The books are in our hands. They're not going to change. I can complain about the fact that monsters have spells that are buried in there, but now I'm not going to be able to change that. So what I can do is try to fix it myself. What are some house rules that I can put in place that make it easier for me to be able to run spellcasting monsters than they have in the book? There's lots of different things that we can do in order to change things, and we should feel free to change them. We should, once we're playing it, when we see the rough edges, when we see things that don't gel with us in our group, we should feel free to try things out, to use it different ways, to come up with new house rules. The system is ours now. We now own it, right? We own 1D&D. We've got it right here. I had to lift it up again. I think I hurt my shoulder, right? We've got it right here. That we have the set of books and they're not going to change. We can't make them change in a way that we want them to. But what we can do is come up with new and interesting ways that we can share with everybody else about ways to make these books work really well for our table. That is something we can do. And maybe the answer to that is trying something else. There are so many great RPGs out there, so many great designers, even in the 5th edition fantasy D20 area, that we can try out and bring from and expand. I've been playing all of them. I've played Level Up Advanced 5e. I've been playing D&D 2024. I've been playing Tales of the Valiant. I'm going to steal ideas from all of them. I have different GM guides that I pull off the shelf for different purposes because one has stuff that I want that the other books don't have. I'm going to try different monsters from it. I'm going to build my own monsters from it. We got all kinds of ways that we can customize our own version of D&D the way that we want. And that is the true 1D&D. The 1D&D is yours. your one D&D, the D&D that you're running at your table with your friends, that you're running the way you want to run it, with the house rules you want to run it, and the way you want to run it, and the format you want to run it, online, in person, however you want to do it. That's the true one D&D, is yours, your D&D, not mine, not Wizards of the Coast, nobody else's. You get to decide what you're going to use. You get to decide how you're going to use it. You get to decide how to change it. And all that matters is what you and your group want to run at your table. Every quarter on the Sly Flourish Patreon, we have a new quarterly Patreon Q&A. Patrons can ask any question they want all throughout the year. Every Friday, I go through all of the current questions and answer them on the Patreon Q&A. Some of those make their way into my new big Patreon Q&A list, and we talk about those here on the show to kind of highlight important things. Knighthood says, I've been interested in doing a Rime of the Frostmaiden campaign for a while now, but I want to change a few things about it before I do. The thing that drew me to Rime of the Frostmaiden in the first place is the idea of a brutal fight for survival in the bitter cold of the far north, where the weather is ultimately more dangerous than the monsters that lurk within it. However, 5e is not super well suited for this style of play, so I was thinking about using Shadowdark instead. I will likely end up homebrewing stuff either way, since I want a more rigorous mechanic for both freezing and starving to death. Who doesn't want more rigorous mechanics for freezing and starving to death? But Shadowdark seems like it might make better foundation for what I want than 5e would. Being someone that has run Rime of the Frostmaiden and Shadowdark in the past, do you think this would be a fitting pair? And if so, what advice might you give to make the experience go smoothly? For the record, I'm already familiar with the advice you've given for Rime of the Frostmaiden and Shadowdark separately, and I'm more interested to hear if there's anything you would recommend specifically for the intersection of the two. First answer is yes, I think they would work very well together. Obviously, I've given my opinion on Rime of the Frostmaiden, and you've already decided you want to run it, so that's totally up to you. I would take a look at, think at Curse Scroll 3, which does some kind of Nordic Viking-y sort of things for Shadowdark. There's probably a lot of material you could harvest from Curse Scroll 3 to add to your Shadowdark game that I think might make it work well with Rime of the Frostmaiden. It's up to you on how you want to handle your freezing and starving to death mechanics. I don't know that I put too much into that, and I would make sure your players are really on board with that sort of survival horror sort of idea. But yeah, I think actually Shadowdark would work very well in the environment of Rime of the Frostmaiden. I think that could work very well. I think the story for Rime of the Frostmaiden is kind of a great big mess, so I would use it more like a setting book and maybe a general plot and theory book than I would to actually try to follow any kind of storyline in there. Like pick which one of those villages they're going to be at. I like Bryn Shander. And obviously you're going to have to reskin all of the monsters and all the encounters and stuff like that, but I don't think that that's particularly difficult for Shadowdark. I think they could work really well. But yeah, it's called Shadowdark, and the idea that there's no sunlight. It's perfect, right? That idea that it's really dark, both overland and dungeons, boy, I would definitely have a chaser campaign for some fun, fey circus stuff from Wild Beyond the Witchlight. I actually think Wild Beyond the Witchlight is a really good chaser to Rime of the Frostmaiden, because Rime of the Frostmaiden can really be dark. But yeah, I think it could work very well. And I think, the reskinning would be there. I would just try to make sure, so I think this works well with Shadowdark and the idea of there's lots of different places to explore and a very loose storyline about where they go. There isn't a major storyline of where they go. They can kind of learn a bunch of different things, put some quests out in front of the characters and make them do it. I think that could work really well. Ark says, I have a question regarding your implementation of Uncharted Journeys for larger groups. Because Uncharted Journeys only provides 4 roles, how do you handle a system with 5 or more players in the party? Our group often operates with 5 to 6 players, and we haven't had much success in making everyone have a meaningful impact. We've tried 1 or 2 double up, Outrider and Sentry usually, and then split the role into one, making the initial check and the other using the ability, but it feels robotic and procedural rather than fun and narrative. So I don't have a great one. The one that we often do is that, yes, 2 people will work together in one role, and that gives one of them advantage on the check. And if you want them both to roll, you can still have them both roll, but they get to use the bonus of whoever is best at it, which is really the same thing as giving the best person advantage on the check. But that way you can give multiple rolls. If you're looking for more rolls, however, if you want people to be able to do even more stuff, take a look at Level Up Advanced 5e's Trials and Treasure book. It has a big section in exploration. And in there, it has dozens of rolls. I don't know if it has 24 rolls, but it's got a lot of rolls, way more rolls than there are character types. So it's got a lot of opportunity to do different things while you're doing your exploration other than the common. So those are 2 ways. One is that you basically have 2 players, 2 characters working together on a single roll. Both of them make a check, but they get to use the bonus of whoever's bonus is best. Or that way they're both rolling. That way you have two players rolling dice rather than just one rolling with advantage. And then the other way would be look at options for more rolls from Level Up Advanced 5e's Trials of the Treasure book, which has a really good set of lots and lots of different rolls of different things you can do. Even the Shadowdark book has more rolls. I think they're not the Shadowdark book, but there's a Shadowdark supplement that also includes like different rolls for all the different ability scores. So you might take a look for that as well. So hopefully that helps. James G says, I'm mindful of your advice to not use monsters or other features to negate the character's abilities. I want your and others' opinion on whether I did that. The party was trying to bait a dragon to come down to Earth. As it did, the wizard cast Hold Monster and used Portent to make it fail its save. The player didn't know I was using monsters from the Iron Kingdoms book, and the dragon's rider had a fury point it could use to give the dragon advantage on the save. As a result, the dragon defeated the Hold Monster and did not crash. I'm not sure if I was squashing the player's clever play or using the monster's resource properly, no different than the legendary resistance, or both. The only way to really know is to talk to your player and ask them how they felt about it, right? And this is really what we're talking about. If the player understood, well, yeah, he's a powerful boss and I know why he got it, and also it burned up a resource that character wouldn't have used otherwise, I think that could be fine. I think that it's really a matter of did they feel cheated or not. I talked previously in this show about using legendary resistances and using doom points to move hit points, to steal hit points from one monster to bolster up the hit points of another after it took a really brutal critical hit. To me, the key of that success was asking the player, how'd you feel about that? And the player said, no, that was totally cool. I thought that was fine, right? Didn't feel robbed. So really that's what we're talking about is the feelings of the players, right? And the only way to know whether or not you took away that character ability or not was if the player felt like you did. And it almost doesn't matter if you did or didn't if the player felt like you did. But it'd be interesting to get some feedback on it and give you an idea of how they feel about it. I don't think you did because it's like, well, like you said, it's kind of a legendary resistance. And also it was like, would the player be getting away with something they shouldn't typically be getting away with by casting Hold Monster on a big flying dragon who then crashes to the ground and takes a bunch of damage? It's also up to you to decide, like, would it have been cooler if that had worked or was it cooler that it didn't? Right. And that's kind of the other trick too, is when you're thinking about the encounter, which way is actually more fun? Would it be kind of like, well, that was really anticlimactic because the dragon died because it fell and died, right, after casting one spell. That might not actually be as cool as it sounds. Or would it have been like, wow, we totally took that dragon down. So something to think about, right? It's something. But I would probably what I would do is ask your player how they felt about it, and then use that as information to help you decide what are the kinds of things that my players are good with monsters pulling off and when not, and then talk to them about it. Like if you're bringing up that Dreadful Blessings idea, if you bring up the idea of Doom Points and you want to use these, definitely talk to your players about what they are and how they work, so they don't feel robbed when they're using it. Jonas G says, I have recently started a Shadowdark group playing Curse Scroll 1. Awesome. That's what I played. I played a whole campaign in there. Even though I told them it's quite a deadly system, they surprised me with an elongated, beautiful character backgrounds. Some of them are also first-time pen and paper players. Now I'm suddenly quite afraid of killing their characters somehow. I was thinking about importing 5e's death mechanics of 3 strikes to increase the odds of survival and have more character-focused campaigns. I don't know. And I do know that there are times where players say something and they don't actually feel that way when it happens. So you will ask them, like, do you want a brutal, gritty system where you could die? Like, yeah. And then their character dies, like, oh no, my character's dead. One way to find out, right? Like, I mean, Shadowdark is originally intended to be that kind of deadly system. And we've had characters who had really big backstories who were killed. So, again, you can kind of have that conversation again, but I might have that conversation and then, and see how they feel before I would start to implement any other kind of house rules. Shadowdark already does have kind of a 5e style death mechanic, which is that you still, when you're down, you still roll a d4 to see if you got death saves. And I have 2 tricks for that I've used. One is there's no such thing as being stable at 0. You have to be healed or you die. That prevents having a character who's at 0, who's being carted around in a cart that can't do anything, and a player who can't really do anything until they get like a healing potion or something like that. So my thought is you have to be restored to 1 hit point if you're going to be effective at all. Now you might decide that a survival, or they're doing some kind of like survival-y check of healing check gives them 1 hit point so they can still move around. You could decide to do that if you want to be really nice. Or you could just say that, no, it doesn't matter how many death saves. If you are not brought back to at least 1 hit point by the end of your death saves, you're going to die. The other one is I like to roll that d4 as a GM and not tell the players what I got, so they don't know how many rounds the character is going to have before they die. The other side, though, is you might just try it, right? Just run it as is, and if a character dies, they die. to quote Draco from Rocky IV, and see how it feels, right? And being cognizant of the players and their feelings on it. But you could also be where like your players actually really wanted to play a more heroic fantasy RPG and found themselves in a dark RPG and weren't ready for it. Like that's a possibility. So you're good asking the question. You're good kind of thinking about this, but you're gonna have to see where it goes. Cedric L says, I've been seeing video from multiple people about YouTube not promoting D&D videos anymore, or content creators quitting making videos for this reason. Since you're not making videos of a full session like Critical Role and others, or even 5e specifically, do you know how this will affect you? The answer is no. I don't know how it'll affect. I actually talked to a bunch of creators about this, and one thing is like, it's still not clear if this is specific to specific channels or if this is more of an endemic thing that's going on. I don't pay a tremendous amount of attention to the views that I get on a particular video. I look, I keep in mind, right? And I have not seen any trends upward or downward. My trends have been generally upward, but mostly because I've been talking a lot about 5th edition D&D 2024 stuff, and that seems to be pretty popular. So I'm not seeing a huge surge one way or the other. But I will give my general thought is that, and it was actually Ginny D who quoted it best to me by saying like, we're renting property. We're building houses on rented ground with YouTube. The shifting grounds of YouTube is something we're not going to be able to control. And it's a giant multi-trillion. I think they're a multi-trillion-dollar company. They're certainly a greater than trillion-dollar company. And we're just here in our basements next to the cat litter making videos, right? And they're going to do whatever they're going to do, and we're not going to be able to do anything about it. And it could have a radical effect on my business that if YouTube fell away, I would probably lose 40% of the new patrons that I'm getting to Patreon. By the way, if you want to support me, whether or not what happens on YouTube, please go consider joining up on Patreon. Join my newsletter and join me on Patreon. But one of the reasons why you don't see me saying, please like, subscribe, and click the bell is because I don't give a crap if you like, subscribe, or click the bell. What I really want is for you to enjoy the stuff that you're seeing. And if you want more of it, joining my newsletter, joining my Patreon, and picking up my books. Because those things are independent of YouTube. Those things are areas where you can come in and connect with me directly. And now it's just you and I, right? No one's in the way. If you join me on Patreon, you and I can talk together. I have the email address of Patreon. If you join my newsletter, it's you and me having emails back and forth through the newsletter, right? That is a direct connection that we have. Those are areas where I am not building on rented ground. Patreon's a little like rented ground, but the difference with Patreon is I have all the email addresses of all of the people who have become a Patreon. So even if Patreon totally tanked, we could still communicate. I could still reach out to you again, right? We didn't break that connection. So that's something I think about with YouTube a lot. And to me, it's not so much like the views going up or down, which certainly is an issue, and no one knows why, and no one knows how the algorithm works, because if they knew exactly how it works, you'd game it. So they're always kind of saying, oh, just make good content and everything will be fine. Well, of course, make good content and everything will be fine. But they could change things pretty radically. A couple ways that they could change them that I'm always keeping my eye on is downgrading videos because you link to things that are external to YouTube. So if you think about TikTok and Instagram, neither of those let you link to content at all. Right? And X, previously Twitter, even back in the good days, was downgrading tweets that had links that were external to Twitter. And the reason why is they don't want you leaving those platforms. They want you to stay on those platforms. Facebook, absolutely the same way. Facebook doesn't want you to leave Facebook. Facebook managed to convince a whole bunch of news agencies to move their news over there rather than get links the other way and then squeeze them for more money for advertisement. Terrible practices. So these platforms are not anybody's friend. They're not your friend. They're not my friend. They are unfortunately the most common way that people find the stuff that we do. Again, more people find me through YouTube than any other way. But my hope is that if you found me through YouTube, that you will also follow me on these other platforms, that it's just a connection between you and I, that there isn't a middleman in the way who's trying to squeeze us through some kind of algorithm in order to feed their trillion-dollar empire. Thank you for asking about that, by the way. Friends, I want to thank all of you for hanging out with me today while we talked about all things in tabletop role-playing games. I hope you enjoyed this show. I always love doing it. It's a great pleasure of mine. If you like this show and you want to help me out, the way you can help me out is by subscribing to my Sly Flourish newsletter. Free link in the links below. You get a free adventure generator for signing up, and you get a free weekly RPG-related email with links to all of the other work that I do. You can support me directly on Patreon. You get access to all kinds of tips, tricks, and tools and other things to help you run your games, our awesome Lazy DM community over on Discord, and you help me put on shows like this. And you can pick up any of my books at the Sly Flourish Bookstore, including City of Arches, Forge of Foes, Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, Lazy DM's Companion, and more, all available in the Sly Flourish Bookstore. Thank you so much. Have a great day, and get out there and play an RPG.